Chapter 591. Riley gave her a big hug. Maisie saw Nolan. Before she could come around to her senses, Riley shook her shoulder and complained, "When did you hook up with this bastard again? Didn't you say you wouldn't forgive him? How could you secretly hook up with him behind my back?" Maisie could see nothing but stars in her vision as Riley shook her. Just when she was about to say something, an arm grabbed her before she fell into a chest. The man behind her secured her tightly in his arms in a protective manner and stared at Riley coldly. Nolan said, "Stop shaking her. Can't you see that she's getting dizzy?" Riley was stunned. Although she hadn't been seeing Nolan for 3 years, he did not look like this at all in her memory. Crossing her arms in front of her chest, she mumbled, "Ha, drop your act, you liar. I know what you're thinking. You too, Z. How can you go back to him just because he said something nice to you?" Riley did not know about the whole story. So she thought Nolan was an asshole who tried to seduce Maisie again. Nolan frowned deeply. It seemed to him that Maisie was the reason this woman before his eyes antagonized him so much. He lowered his head to look at the person in his arms and parted his lips open. "What did I lie to you about?" Riley spoke before Maisie could say anything. "Stop playing the fool, dickhead. 3 years ago, you were the one who forced Z to get a divorce from you. Not only that, but you even said some nasty things to hurt her. You even told her that you had had enough of her, so you're going to ditch her, and now you're coming back for her again? You truly are the most shameless person I've ever seen." Riley. Maisie was trying to say something because she could sense that Nolan's face was getting darker and darker. However, Riley didn't get her signal and continued. "Stop speaking up for him. If he hadn't forced you to get a divorce, you wouldn't have gotten into Quincy appeared in the nick of time and covered her mouth. He pulled her to the side and said, "Ms. Hill, there's no use in saying these right now. Mr. Goldman doesn't remember anything now." "What do you mean by he doesn't remember?" Riley abruptly stopped, and she looked toward Maisie and Nolan. If it were in the past, Nolan would have lost his temper if she dared to badmouth him in front of him. However, not only did Nolan have no reaction to everything she said, but he didn't even know how to react. "Come with me." Not wanting Riley to mess things up, Quincy pulled her out of the office. There were only 2 people left in the office, and the atmosphere became tense. Before Maisie could say anything, Nolan suddenly turned her around to meet his gaze. What exactly did that woman try to say? Just now Maisie was having a headache. She hadn't been able to explain anything to Riley yet. So Riley's misunderstanding of Nolan was still stuck at 3 years ago. "Is what she said true?" Nolan asked in a deep voice, and a hint of emotion crossed the depth of his eyes. "I was the one who forced you to get a divorce with me? I was the one who hurt you with those words?" "Nolan." Maisie lifted her head. She put her finger on his solid hard chest and said, "There are a lot of things I can't tell you right now. Let's wait until you regain your memories first. Okay?" Nolan grabbed her hand and took a step closer to her. "Why must you wait until I regain my memories?" Maisie had no way to retreat anymore. He placed his big hands on the desk, leaned forward slightly, and confined her in his arms. He then turned his face to meet her eyes. "I don't have any memory of you, but I want to know everything that happened between you and me." Maisie was stunned. Their lips were very close to each other right now, and the warmth of his breath had caused her heart to stir. Just when she was lost in a trance, Nolan pressed forward and covered her mouth with his own. Maisie's pupils constricted, and she subconsciously put her hands on his shoulders, the taste of him filling her mouth. After a long while, Nolan's lips left hers, and he rubbed his fingers against her chin. He looked at her intently and said, "I don't remember about you, but I don't know why. The moment I saw you, I knew you meant a lot to me." Chapter 592. Nolan couldn't remember Maisie, so by right, she shouldn't be able to affect him. However, that was not the case in reality. From the moment he had seen her, he was drawn to her like a magnet. He wanted to take care of her, love her, and get closer to her. His heart was pounding rapidly, his pulses went out of control, and his body temperature rose gradually. Maisie could even feel the heat of his body through his hand. Maisie returned to her senses and cupped his face. She parted her cherry-red lips slightly and asked, "Are you confessing to me?" Nolan squinted his eyes, but did not say anything. Maisie wrapped her hand around his waist and pressed her face on his chest. While she listened to his heartbeat, she continued, "Nolan, I'll wait for the day you remember everything, no matter how long it takes. You still owe me a promise, so you have to get your memory back." Nolan pressed her thin lip tightly as he moved his hand over her hair that draped over her shoulder in a long cascade. "I still owe her a promise? What is it then? In any case..." He swore to himself that he would regain his memories. After Nolan left, Riley sat on the couch and reflected on herself. I didn't know that Mr. Goldman has lost his memory. I just let my anger get the best of me. I didn't mean anything. Maisie flipped through the document and replied, "Yeah, you should consider yourself lucky since he has lost his memory. If not, in other words, Nolan wouldn't mind the things that Riley said right now." Riley pouted. Quincy had told her everything when they were outside. Nolan had forced Maisie to get a divorce because he was infected with and he only encountered Maisie when he went to Staslo. After going through some incidents, they had gotten back together again. Just when they had thought their peaceful life was about to begin, Nolan lost his memory. Riley wondered if both of them had done something wrong and offended God. Otherwise, why would so many things happen to them? Anyway, what brought you here today? Maisie put down the document and lifted her head to look at her. Riley replied, "I heard that you returned, so I figured I should pay you a visit. Then, I ran into Mr. Goldman when I was in the elevator." Maisie lifted her eyebrows and asked, "I remember I didn't make any announcement saying that I'm coming back. Who told you?" Riley pouted and replied, "Who told me that?" "Your cousin, of course." "Louis?" Maisie stared at Riley intently, and it made Riley feel uncomfortable. "Why are you staring at me like that? Seems like you've been in touch with Louis quite often." Maisie smiled. "It's because of you," Riley replied. She suddenly remembered something, and her face turned sour. "He knows that I've been in touch with you in the past few years. So he has been pestering me and demanding me to disclose your whereabouts. When I out that I was chatting with you last time, he snatched my phone. I kicked him, and then I lost my job." As Riley was talking, her voice gradually became louder. "Your cousin is a psychopath. He's the meanest and most petty man I've ever met. All I did was kick him, and do you know what he did to me? He put me on a blacklist. I can't even get a job, and even if I did get one, those people wouldn't want me because of him. He also said that I'd be begging him one day." Maisie rose to her feet and sat beside her. "So, did you beg him?" "I'm a person with a backbone, so how could I possibly beg?" Riley crossed her arms in front of her chest and harumphed. "I'd rather be jobless than begging him. All I need to do is stay. I might not have any money to spend, but it's still not a problem for me to put food on the table." Maisie stood up and said, "Anyway, since you're here, why don't you come with me to the Lucas mansion? In the administrative department of Black Gold." Several managers were reporting to Nicholas in the office. Suddenly, the door was pushed open, and they all turned their heads around. When they saw Nolan, they were shocked. Nicholas lifted his head to look at him and asked, "What are you doing here?" "I just came to have a look," Nolan said as he took a seat on the couch. "You guys can proceed." Chapter 593. Nolan had not been handling the company's affairs for the past 3 years. They had heard that he was suffering from a serious illness and that he needed to recuperate. Since he had returned, did this mean that he had recovered? Nicholas closed the document and said, Let's adjourn the meeting. They nodded and went out of the office. Sitting in the leather chair, Nicholas turned around to look at Nolan and asked, "Can I take this as you're ready to take over the company now?" Nolan leaned on the couch, rested his arm on the edge of the couch, and replied, "I've read all the documents, and I've memorized everything I need to remember. I think I'm ready." Nicholas rose to his feet slowly. "All right, then. I won't stop you if you insist. However, a lot of things have changed, and the company the same as when you first took over. If you have any questions, you can always ask Quincy." He had been 16 years old when he took over Black Gold. He had learned how to manage the company while he attended school. Although Nolan had lost most of his memories, he still had the experience. Besides, he had Quincy to help him. So it shouldn't be a problem for him to get used to it in a short time. That being said, Nicholas still hoped that he could regain his memory as soon as possible. Nicholas headed out of the door and said something to Quincy before leaving. After Quincy saw him off, he turned around and went back into the office. "Mr. Goldman, are you going to take over the company now?" "Yeah," Nolan replied as he lowered his head. "I want to see if the Black Gold Group can bring back any memories." He got up and walked over to his desk. He ran his fingertips across the desktop, glanced at the books displayed on the shelves, and sat down on the leather chair. Quincy walked forward and asked, "Do you want me to show you around the company, Mr. Goldman? See if it'll remind you of something?" Nolan lifted his head to look at him. "Do you think I'll get lost in the company?" He had just lost his memory, not turned stupid. Quincy let out a smile, but he did not say anything. At the Lucas mansion, Larissa studied the ring in her hand. She knew that this ring belonged to, it was her father, Hernandez. He would wear this ring wherever he went. She returned the ring to Maisie and said, "Since your grandfather gave it to you, you should keep it." Maisie was stunned for a moment before she took over the thing. Larissa's face was gloomy. "I didn't expect something like this would happen to your grandfather. I didn't even get a chance to see him for one last time." "I didn't get to see him either. Although I held a funeral for him, the coffin is empty. Honestly, I still can't believe that he's dead. They couldn't find him when he was alive, and they couldn't retrieve his body after he was dead. He couldn't even come back to his own home." Larissa held her hand and said, "The past is in the past. The Kents are gone. Z. We have to keep moving forward." Maisie knew what Larissa was trying to say. Her father, Sherry, and the baby in her womb were dead, but she was still alive and needed to keep moving forward. Riley and Louis sat in the living room while waiting for Maisie. Louis took a sip of coffee, darted a glance at Riley, and said, "It has been 2 months. Seems like you're tougher than I thought. Why? Do you want me to apologize for kicking you?" "Fat chance." Riley harumphed and turned her head around. Louis put the cup down and continued, "It's fine. We're getting married, anyway. It will be too late if you want to apologize at that time." "Oh gosh," Riley suddenly remembered something and covered her head fretfully. "I've forgotten about that," Louis chuckled and said, "If you say sorry to me now, I will let you off the hook this time." Unfortunately, Riley paid him no mind. She said, "How could I forget about something like this? No way. I must stop this nightmare from happening." She shot up to her feet. Louis knew what she wanted to do and laughed coldly. "What would Mr. Hill think if you tell my mom that you want to cancel the marriage?" Chapter 594. Riley froze. Her father had been nagging her about her marriage with Louis, and the only reason he was letting her stay in his house was that he thought she had decided to marry Louis. "Will my father chase me out of the house if I tell him that I want to cancel the marriage?" She turned back to the couch and sat down. Looking at Louis, she said, "But if it's your family that canceled the marriage, my father wouldn't force me to marry you." Louis's eyes glimmered. Everyone in Basburg knows about the marriage between our families, so do you think it's that easy to cancel it? Besides, even if we want to cancel the marriage, your family will get the short end of the stick. Do you think your father would allow something like that to happen? Riley did not know what to say. Just when she was hemming and hawing, Maisie and Larissa came downstairs. When Larissa saw them, she smiled and said, "Riley, what are you guys talking about?" "Aunt Larissa." We're talking about our marriage," Louis chimed in. Something was glittering in his eyes as he continued. "I think it's about time for us to get engaged, right?" Riley's expression changed. She knew that Louis must be doing this on purpose when she saw the meaningful grin on his face. He's willing to sacrifice one of the most important life events in his life just because I kicked him? He's going to get back at me after the engagement, right? Larissa smiled. She turned around and said to Maisie, "Z, you're Riley's friend. She's going to become your cousin-in-law." Maisie glanced at Riley and replied, "Yeah. I didn't see that coming either." After leaving the Lucas mansion, Riley walked up to the car and kicked the tire. "I'm done for. He must be doing this to get it back at me for kicking him. What I'm gonna do now?" Maisie patted her shoulder and said, "Calm down. Being angry won't get you anywhere." Riley got into the car and put on the seatbelt. "I thought I could run away from it if I didn't mention it for the past 3 years." Maisie turned around to look at her and said, "Louis is good-looking and talented. He's a very good candidate when it comes to being a husband, and the socialites in Basburg want to marry him. Why does it seem to me that you don't like him very much?" Jerking her head, Riley stared at Maisie and replied, "Z, don't try to speak up for him just because he's your cousin. I admit that he's really handsome, but he has the worst personality. If I really become his wife, he will certainly make my life harder than living in hell, so, what are you worried about?" Riley paused for a moment. She lowered her head slightly and continued. "It's just a marriage of convenience. I don't know much about him, and we don't love each other at all. Z. In the past, you kept saying that you wished you were me, but now, I wish I were you. At the very least, you married a man who you love and loves you back." Maisie's eyes swiveled around her socket as if she was thinking something. Suddenly, she placed her hand on her shoulder and said, "I can help you to feel him out." In the evening, Maisie returned to the Goldman mansion and saw Quincy saying something to the butler. When the butler noticed her, he nodded at her and said, "Welcome back, madam." Maisie scanned around the living room and asked, "Isn't the dinner ready?" "Where's Nolan?" Quincy cleared his throat and said awkwardly, "Mr. Goldman is in the study room, and I think he's feeling a little defeated." "Feeling defeated? Nolan? Why?" Maisie asked. After a short while of contemplation, Quincy replied, "Mr. Goldman went back to the Black Gold Group today. He has forgotten many things, and the interior has changed a lot over the years, so understanding instantly dawned upon Maisie, and she interrupted him. The others didn't suspect anything. Did they? Quincy was taken aback for a moment before he replied, "Some of them did, but they didn't have the guts to ask anything. Mr. Goldman took over the Black Gold Group so soon because he wants to regain his memory as soon as possible." Maisie walked upstairs and stopped in front of the study room. Just when she was about to push the door, a tall figure appeared in front. Chapter 595. Nolan's expression was dark, and he was dumbfounded when he saw Maisie. Just when Maisie was about to say something, he hugged her and buried his head in her shoulder. Maisie froze, but allowed him to hug her. She did not know if she was hallucinating or not. But it seemed to her that Nolan was asking for comfort. She asked, "Nolan?" He tightened his arms and said, "Do you think I'm silly? I can't even remember the area assigned within my own company." Maisie was stunned, and then she chuckled. It occurred to her that this man had forced himself to act as if nothing happened and come back to seek comfort. "It's your company. Why do you still have to worry about other people laughing at you?" Nolan pushed her away and grabbed her shoulders. He stared fixedly at her and asked, "What if they laugh at me?" Maisie lifted his chin and raised her eyebrows. "Who dares to laugh at my man?" Nolan looked at her silently. Nobody knew what he was thinking right now. Suddenly, Daisy poked her head out and asked, "Mommy, are you and Daddy hugging and kissing?" A second head poked out behind her. Colton covered his face and said, "Mommy, you and Daddy can go on. We didn't see anything at all." You two dash before Maisie could finish her sentence, Nolan suddenly pinched her chin and turned her face to face him. He then planted his lips on hers in front of the children. Both of the kids covered their eyes with their hands and peeked through the slits of their fingers. Although their father had lost his memory, he still knew how to take advantage of the opportunity and flirt with their mother. "Nolan!" Maisie shouted as she pushed him away, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "You can't do that in front of the kids." Nolan replied nonchalantly, "My dad used to kiss my mom every time in front of me when I was still a kid. I don't see any problem for me to do that to you." Maisie was stunned. This guy really thinks he can say anything just because he has lost his memory? Really? Daisy ran up to him. She raised her head to look at him and continued, "Daddy, did Grandpa kiss Grandma a lot when he was young too?" Colton came over and chimed in, Daddy, I want to hear more stories about Grandpa and Grandma." Maisie looked at Nolan. Initially, she thought Nolan would refuse to answer anything about his mother. However, little did she expect that he held both of the kids' hands and said, "You guys want to know more about them?" Both Daisy and Colton nodded. "Let's go have our dinner first. After that, I'll tell you more about them." Nolan replied with a smile. He then carried them downstairs. And it seemed to Maisie that he was very comfortable becoming their father. Both of the kids were delighted. Maisie stood at the same spot and watched their backs as they walked down the stairs. She lowered her head slightly, and it seemed like he knew how to get along with the kids after losing his memory. When they finished their dinner, Nolan took the children for a walk in the courtyard and even played with them together. The children didn't take his memory loss seriously at all. Instead, they liked him better now. Maisie stood on the balcony and looked at them with a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Nicholas walked up to her and looked down at the courtyard as well. Although Nolan has lost his memory, he still loves them the same way. Maisie turned her head around to look at Nicholas and said, "Dad, thank you for taking care of the kids in the past 3 years." Nicholas waved his hand and replied, "Don't mention it. They are all my grandchildren, and it's thanks to them that I don't feel so lonely staying in the Goldman mansion." He then withdrew his gaze and looked at Maisie. "I guess my father wouldn't say no to you and Nolan anymore, right?" Maisie was stunned. Although Titus had not said anything, his attitude toward her obviously had softened after Rowena's incident. Chapter 596. Although Grandpa is a stubborn man, he's always kept the kindness that the Summers had shown him in the past in his mind. He wouldn't be so biased if Rowena weren't from the Summers. Nicholas sighed. He harbored hatred for the Nobles in his mind. Not to mention that Rowena kept sowing discord between you and him at his side. That's why my father wouldn't let things slide until he saw the truth with his own eyes. Maisie could understand the implicit meaning behind Nicholas' words. Titus was no longer obsessed with interfering in Nolan's affairs after the incident that involved Rowena. He's so stubborn that he wouldn't listen to any advice, so we could only wait for him to see the truth by himself. Even though the process of getting to the bottom of the truth almost cost Nolan his life. The night had come. Nolan and Colton were taking a bath in the bathroom. Colton sat in the bathtub and played with the little yellow duck in his hand. Nolan, who was standing under the shower, twisted the tap and adjusted the temperature of the water to a moderate warmth. The water sprinkled over his face as if there was a layer of mist covering his facial features. Colton was lying on the side of the bathtub on his tummy and stared at Nolan. "It's my first time taking a bath with you, Daddy." Nolan stopped showering himself and turned to look at the young child. His gaze was suddenly fixed on the little yellow duck that was floating on the surface of the water as if it was a familiar scene to him. He turned the water down. "Really?" Colton nodded sincerely. "Yes, can I still take a couple's bath with you in the future?" Nolan facepalmed himself. "Who taught you that this is called a couple's bath?" Colton blinked. "Wouldn't it be a couple's bath when two people are taking a bath together?" "He's not wrong about that." Nolan picked up the towel and wrapped it around his waist, walked over to the bathtub, and dried Colton's hair for him with another towel. "You're still young. And you will know what a couple's bath is when you grow up. Then have Daddy and Mommy ever taken a couple's bath together?" Nolan froze in place. He squinted as he stared at the innocent boy in front of him, and he could not be sure whether this little kid had asked on purpose or not. There was a sudden knock on the door. Maisie leaned against the wall and yelled, "You guys have been in the shower for such a long time, are you done already?" At that moment, the bathroom door was pulled open. Nolan was wrapped in a towel from the waist down, revealing only his well-built and sturdy upper body. The misty water droplets on his body and the damp fog assaulted her head-on together with the fragrance of the shampoo. Maisie was stunned for a moment. Her eyes were fixed on the towel that was hanging on his waist for a split second before she looked away subconsciously. Nolan noticed her flushed ears and narrowed his eyes. Colton suddenly looked up at Nolan. "Daddy, can I take a couple's bath with you again tomorrow?" Nolan's body stiffened. "A couple's bath?" Maisie crossed her arms and glared at Nolan. "Did you teach him that?" "Daddy, that's a promise, okay? Good night." Colton abandoned his father at that very moment, dashed out of the room, and disappeared into the corridor. Nolan's expression looked tense, but he could not say that the boy had learned it by himself, so he cleared his throat faintly, admitting it indirectly. Maisie was about to turn around when he hurriedly pulled her back. "I won't teach Colton these things again in the future." Maisie turned around in surprise. "He thinks that I'm angry? So is this an apology?" After a long time, she burst into a chuckle. "Okay, I know that you're not the one who taught him that. You're taking the blame for Colton, aren't you? After all, I'm the one who gave birth to that rascal. How could I not know what was going on in that cunning mind of his as his mother? He's taking advantage of his father's amnesia and has set him up. This is something that only Colton would do." Nolan took a step forward and pushed her against the wall. His lips and nose hovered over her skin as he lowered his voice. "You blushed." Chapter 597. At that moment, Nolan did not sound provocative like he did before he lost his memory. His expression did not change at all as he stared straight at her with his profound eyes. He did not give off any primitive thoughts, but sounded extremely serious. Maisie's heart skipped a beat as she felt a rise in the temperature through her palms that were propping against his body. This meant he was already on the verge of losing control. "Nolan, don't." His lips touched her ear as if it was a peck. "I can't do anything as long as I can't remember shit, can't I?" Maisie was taken aback. The warm breath that he exhaled wrapped her in turbulence, and the smile lines found on the corners of his mouth deepened. "Don't you love to tease me?" Maisie pursed her lips tightly. Their ears and temples were so close that she could no longer pretend to be calm. Nolan whispered in her ear, bewitching her, "You're my wife. And you have to do your part." He then moved his lips away from her ear and pressed them firmly against hers. Everything went out of control with this one kiss. Maisie was dragged into the abyss by him, forgetting that Nolan had lost his memory. Nolan walked to the bathroom with Maisie in his arms and carried her into the bathtub with him. Maisie leaned against his arms gently as the affection between the two permeated the whole bathroom. Nolan caressed her smooth and delicate skin with his palms. brushed her black hair with his fingers, and kissed her. Have we ever taken a couple's bath before? Maisie responded a little drowsily as she opened her eyes languidly. No, he chuckled. Then we've done it now. He then pinched her chin, turned her face around, and kissed the tip of her nose and then her lips. Maisie hit him feebly. You're the one who asked me to be serious, but you're also the one who gets all playful now. Are you doing this on purpose? Nolan wrapped his arms around her waist and placed his chin next to her neck. You're the one who has been teasing and seducing me ever since I lost my memory. So you're the reasonable one now, huh? Well, I can't help it. Nolan's voice sounded aggrieved but provocative at the same time. Who asked you to seduce me in the first place? Maisie looked at him. The warmth on her cheeks had not faded, looking extremely captivating. Since when did I seduce you? He smiled and kissed her. You don't even know that you've seduced a man. You're really a bad woman. Nolan picked her up from the bathtub and carried her back to the bed. He then turned off the light, pulled the blanket to cover the both of them and laid beside her. Maisie seemed to have become more calculative about him and placed pillows in between the two of them. Don't cross this line. Nolan threw the pillows away and hugged her tightly from behind. I only wanted to see if you would pounce onto me in the middle of the night the other day. Maisie remained motionless. Nolan buried himself in the back of her neck, inhaling the scent she exuded. So. It turns out that my wife is just a seductress that's all bark and no bite. Maisie scoffed angrily. Never have I thought that my scheme would be turned against me in the future. Turns out that no matter whether Nolan has amnesia or not, he's still a trickster. I'd been deceived by his innocent appearance ever since he got diagnosed with amnesia. When she woke up the next day, Nolan had already gone to the company. She changed her clothes and went downstairs for breakfast, but she heard several maids gossiping about something. Mr. Goldman doesn't have amnesia, right? If it weren't for his memory loss, why would Mr. Goldman not even be able to distinguish the internal departments of the Black Gold Group? He's the boss of the company, so he should be exceptionally familiar with its internal structure. Shouldn't he? They noticed a figure approaching them as soon as they said that. They trembled with fright and quickly put down the cell phones. Madam. Maisie asked calmly, what are you looking at? The maids looked at each other and did not know what to say. So they handed one of the phones to Maisie. Maisie grabbed the phone from them and took a glance at it. Hashtag Mr. Goldman of the Black Gold Group lost his memory due to the death of his wife. He can't remember the internal structure of his own company. The Black Gold Group's future is concerning hashtag. Chapter 598. Many Black Gold employees were discussing the news. It said that Mr. Goldman left Black Gold 3 years ago because he was gravely ill. I wonder what kind of illness he has. It's so serious that he even lost his memory. No wonder I heard that Mr. Goldman was late at the meeting yesterday afternoon because he went to the wrong meeting room. And it was a cleaner who showed him the way. A female employee who was putting on makeup in front of the mirror looked at them. The conference room that Mr. Goldman went to was converted into a reception room a few years ago. And Mr. Goldman was the one who ordered the change back then. He can't even remember the conference room that he gave the order to change. Did he lose his memory, or has he lost his soul? Another female employee sighed. His wife ran into an accident 3 years ago. He lost his wife and became seriously ill, and has now lost his memory. Nothing worse could happen to anyone else already. At the administrative office, Nolan flung a magazine under the desk backhandedly and lifted his hand to cover his forehead, the veins on the back of his hand throbbing. What do they mean by losing my wife? Quincy had no choice but to pick up the magazine. What Mr. Goldman cares about is the statement of him losing his wife. Mr. Goldman, that doesn't seem to be the point, they're cursing my wife. Nolan tapped the desk with a gloomy expression. Isn't that still not the point? Quincy hesitated before he wanted to speak up, but the door of the office was pushed open at that moment, and Nicholas walked in with a golden cane. "Didn't I ask Quincy to bring you around the company to get acquainted with our internal structure yesterday? And you're giving me such news now?" Nolan leaned against the back of his seat, fidgeting with the pen in his hand, but did not speak. Nicholas said in a deep voice, "I told you that Black Gold isn't the company that you knew when you first took over. You should get to know Black Gold if you don't remember anything about it, starting from the basics. Do you know how many proposals and contracts have been sent to the company ever since the news came out?" Nolan frowned, and his eyes dimmed. Quincy wanted to report this to Nolan, but he never had a chance to speak up. 6 companies have sent contracts to us, 2 of which were once Black Gold's rivals, and one of them is on the verge of going bankrupt. They're just trying to take advantage of your memory loss to fool you into doing charity. Nolan laughed angrily. "So they're taking me as a fool now?" Nicholas turned his head to Quincy and ordered, "Get someone to suppress the news and return those contracts to where they came from." Quincy nodded and left. Nicholas walked to the desk and said earnestly, "Don't let the news affect your judgment." Nolan. Even if he did not finish his sentence, he had already expressed everything that he wanted to say. Even though Nolan had lost his memory, he was still the one and only Nolan Goldman. He would be able to secure his position as the Nolan Goldman of Bassburg, just like how he had stabilized his position in the city back then. The news was soon suppressed, but Nolan was still a hotly discussed figure. Maisie was sitting in the cafe in her sunglasses and waiting for someone else when she heard a lot of people talking about Nolan. Nolan Goldman of Bassburg, who always had the power to turn the whole city upside down with only a snap of his fingers, had been exposed to be suffering from amnesia. As a result, many people started making plans to take advantage of his condition to make a move on him. People who had never had the chance to collaborate with the Goldmans wanted to take this opportunity to curry favor with the family and had sent in a lot of proposals to the Black Gold Group, rather than intending to form a mutual collaboration relationship. It was more appropriate to say that they wanted to make a fool out of the amnesiac multimillionaire to see whether he was willing to lend them a helping hand to relieve them from their financial fix. Maisie took a sip of coffee, and the corners of her lips twitched as a tall figure slowly approached her table. "Nolan may be suffering from amnesia, but he's not a fool." Lewis grabbed a seat and sat down, and then the waiter stepped forward to get his order. Lewis ordered a cup of Jamaican Blue Mountain and waited for the waiter to leave before saying, "Has Riley come to you with tons of complaints?" Maisie removed her sunglasses and placed them on the table, next to her hands. "You bullied her and have also caused her to lose her job. So why can't she badmouth you?" Chapter 599. Lewis scoffed. "So you've asked me out just to teach me a lesson on behalf of your best friend?" Maisie stopped beating around the bush and asked, "Lewis, do you really want to marry Riley?" Lewis frowned slightly, but his slender and beautiful slanted eyes did not give off any emotion as they looked extremely calm. Maisie picked up her cup. "I know that both the Hills and Lucases are a great match for each other, and both families are related through previous marriages. That's the reason the marriage between the two of you is what the elders of both families want to see. But you can't sacrifice your own happiness because of marriage. Riley is my best friend, and you're my cousin. You guys are going to be a pain in my ass whenever you have an argument in the future." The waiter brought Lewis's coffee and put it in front of him. Lewis held the cup and looked out the window. "We won't have any arguments in the future." Maisie was puzzled. He took a sip of the hot coffee and looked away from the window. "My mother will force me to marry other women that I'm unfamiliar with even if I don't marry Riley. Compared to those women, I'm relatively close with Riley, so I won't go against this marriage." "So do you just plan to settle with this relationship?" Maisie rested her chin on her hand. "A man might be able to settle with a marriage relationship because it's not a huge issue for him to marry a woman that he doesn't like. At the end of the day, He can choose to leave her at home all the time. Louis remained silent momentarily, put down the cup, and smiled. How can you be so sure that I'm settling with this relationship? Maisie was stunned for a split second and did not speak after that. I'm only an outsider. Not someone who's been immersed in this relationship since day one. As such, I don't know what has been on his mind all this while. Looking at this matter from the perspective of Riley's best friend, I really don't want to see Riley give up on her happiness for the rest of her life. However, if I were to look at this from Louis's point of view, he's always wanted to marry someone with whom he can spend the rest of his life. If he only wanted to find a random woman who is willing to marry him, he would have listened to his mother's arrangement and married one of those strange women, right? Is it possible that I'm the only person in this world who can make a match out of Riley and Louis? Naturally. Riley's first reaction was to spit out the sip of coffee she had just drunk when Maisie mentioned the matter. Z, has he bribed you? Maisie shrugged. I don't think my cousin is joking. Riley put down the cup heavily and said in a sullen voice, please keep me out of this. Plenty of ladies in Basburg had taken a fancy to him before this, yet he didn't even give any one of them a chance. Why would he agree to marry me? Yeah. Maisie recalled what he had said. I'm very curious too. Anyway, both of you are only getting engaged for now. There's still time after this for you to try to get along after the engagement. So, if you were to find out that you're definitely not made for each other after the engagement, you could still choose to bid him goodbye after that. Riley looked at her in astonishment. Are you trying to match me with him? Maisie gave off a wide grin. Riley, it's time for you to find yourself a boyfriend. Since an opportunity has been presented to you, why not take it? How would you know if he's the right man or not before you gave it a try? Riley smiled awkwardly and quickly changed the subject. If you have the time to worry about me now, you might as well worry about your husband first. Maisie propped her hand against her chin, raised her eyebrows, and smirked. There's nothing for me to worry about when it comes to him. He has only lost his memory, not his mind. The news you've seen is only one side of the whole situation. Riley picked up the cake on the table, tasted it, and licked the corner of her mouth. You've heard the rumors that Mr. Goldman lost his wife and his memory, right? Well, those prestigious and wealthy families who have daughters are already planning to introduce their daughters to Mr. Goldman. The smile on Maisie's face disappeared. What? Introduce their daughters to Nolan? Riley leaned towards her. Z, you have to be careful as Mr. Goldman has lost his memory. Don't give those bitches a chance at success. You've returned to Zlokova in a rather low-key fashion this time around. So those bastards and batches really think you're dead and already can't wait for Mr. Goldman to marry someone else. Riley winked at Maisie as she said that and added, Mr. Goldman sells like a hot cake in Zlokova. Those ladies are already drooling over the idea of becoming your kids' stepmothers. Chapter 600. Maisie forced a smile. It seems that I might have to rise from the dead. She then grabbed her handbag and got up. Riley stared at her. Are you heading back already? Those people will come to my house and snatch the crown from the queen's head if I choose not to go back now. Maisie left without looking back. Riley waved at her. All hail the queen. At Black Gold. Maisie and Sadai passed by the front desk. When the receptionists who were chatting at the front desk noticed two silhouettes passing by, they raised their heads one after another. The two figures had headed toward the elevator, and the long-haired woman looked quite familiar. But they could not remember where they had seen her before this. Does that woman look familiar to you? That's weird. Who gave them the courage to use the elevator that's dedicated to Mr. Goldman? Holy shit. When the two receptionists noticed something, they immediately trotted toward her. Maisie was about to step into the elevator when one arm hurriedly grabbed her from behind. Ma'am. The female receptionist was panting a little, but still had a professional smile on her face. "I'm sorry, but this elevator is dedicated only to Mr. Goldman. Which means you're not allowed to use it." "Oh really?" Maisie did not take off her sunglasses, but only took a glance at them and then asked, casually, "Can't I use this elevator?" The two receptionists looked at each other as they were secretly scrutinizing Maisie's attire. They also realized that the woman standing next to the long-haired woman looked like someone they should not trifle with. Thus, they did not dare to act tough. Mr. Goldman's dedicated elevator isn't meant to be used by anyone other than himself. This will make our lives very difficult if someone finds out that we've allowed you to use it. Mr. Goldman has just returned and taken over the company again, and now, a woman appears out of nowhere, looking for Mr. Goldman. She even dares to take the elevator that's dedicated to Mr. Goldman and Mr. Goldman only, Maisie chuckled. "Don't worry, Nolan won't blame you for this." When the two receptionists heard Maisie addressing Nolan by his first name, they instantly realized she was surely a big gun too. Maisie never took off her sunglasses, but stepped into the elevator with Sadai. This elevator could only ascend directly to the administration department. Maisie and Sadai came out of the elevator. All the employees working in the administration department were busy, and they hardly realized their existence. Maisie was walking toward Nolan's office when Quincy happened to come out of the room, and his expression changed slightly. "Ms. Vanderbilt?" Maisie stared at him suspiciously, and then a man's laughter came from Nolan's office. "Mr. Goldman. How could you forget Z? The two of you have even dated before." A woman's euphemistic voice then sounded before Nolan could respond. "Dad, that's all in the past already. Nolan definitely doesn't remember me now." Nolan intertwined his fingers and placed his hands in front of his thin lips while his eyes looked unfathomable. "What did you say your daughter's name is?" "Maisie. You might have forgotten about it. But you two indeed had been together in the past." Mr. Hannigan gently pushed Maisie with his hand that was placed on her shoulder, motioning her to do something. Maisie picked the teacup up, got up, and walked toward Nolan. "Knowles, it doesn't matter if you've forgotten about me. I'll remind you." She sat beside Nolan, but he moved away from her, obviously unwilling to let her get any closer. His thin lips moved slightly. "As I recall, I don't know any Maisie Hannigan." Maisie was slightly embarrassed. Mr. Hannigan felt the same too. It said that his deceased wife's name was Maisie, homophone to the name of my daughter. It's rumored that he's lost his memory, so how could he still remember things like this? "Nolan, I'm Z." Maisie could not wait to stick herself onto Nolan's body. But when she was inches away from being able to touch Nolan, the office's door was suddenly pushed open. Quincy stood outside the door, wiping the tip of his nose. Mr. Hannigan knows that Mr. Goldman has lost his memory. So he brought his daughter here to take advantage of Mr. Goldman's condition. However, what he doesn't know is that Mr. Goldman's wife is still alive and kicking.